Hi guys, so in today's video we are doing IT in business and this is a summary video, right? So the first thing that we have to look at it is what IT is, the definition of what IT is. So IT stands for information technology, and this is a system or a tool that is used in business in order to capture, manipulate, and store and retrieve data. So what we are saying is that when we say the term IT, especially in a business context, we are basically saying that this is a tool or a system that a specific business is going to use in order to basically collect the data, analyze the data, store the data, and be able to retrieve the data whenever it needs it, right? So we could look at examples such as telecommunication systems. We could look at things like the computer hardware, what you can touch in the computer, as well as the computer software, what you can't touch in the computer, right? As well as database management systems, right? So what is the role played by IT? Why do we need it in a business? What are its advantages, right? So the first thing that we look at is that it betters communication. Secondly, it improves effectiveness in the business. It improves innovation. It provides security of sensitive information, and it keeps people easily connected, right? So those are some of the roles that you could look at that IT plays. And then we could look at the next thing that we look at is data processing into information. So as you guys should know that data is unstructured, right? So that's literally a bunch of, I don't want to say information, but let me say a bunch of unstructured information. A bunch of unprocessed information that you collect, right? And then when you now process the information and you take out the important parts from the data, you are then turning the data into information. So then now we look at how then do you turn the data into information, right? And there are 5 steps that you look at. It starts as raw data. You have collected this unstructured, unprocessed information, right? And it's raw data. And then you are going to analyze, take out all the important stuff, clean the data. And after you've cleaned the data, now you have information, right? After you have this information, you now need to turn this information into knowledge, right? So meaning that you need to now understand what the data that you've just cleaned means, right? So you need to interpret it and then turn that knowledge that you received from the information into wisdom. In the wisdom part, we are basically just saying that you have understood, you've analyzed this information, but what now you need to do is to allow that information to help you make decisions, right, in an entity, right? Data should be processed so that it provides useful information to its users, right? So we have data, we've just collected this bunch of unstructured information, but we need to process it so that we get useful information out of it. So we don't just want any information, we want information that is useful. And how would we then determine whether the information that we have processed is useful? We would look at these characteristics. So we'd look at whether the data is relevant. Is the data that I'm using relevant to the problem that I'm trying to solve, right? And then we would look at whether it's reliable. Is the data that I collected from a reliable source, right? Am I giving the right statistics, right? You can't be saying that the VAT rate is 17% when it's 15%. So is the data that is the information that we have processed reliable? Is it from a reliable source, right? Then we could look at timeliness. So with timeliness, you need to ensure that you are collecting the data and analyzing it in a specific period of time when you need it, right? You can't provide data. For example, let's say you have an order at 10 a.m. tomorrow and you will collect and analyze a specific information, but you are going to provide that to management a week later. You need to use that information tomorrow by 10. So you need to ensure that you process that information before 10 a.m. So that's what we mean by it needs to be timely, right? It needs to be accurate. So it must be free from error, basically. It must be complete. So you can't be telling us the name of the customer, but not telling us the phone number of the customer, the email address of the customer, when the order is supposed to be given out. and where it's going to be delivered. So you need to give us complete information that will allow us as management to make the decision, right? It must be summarized. So you can't be giving us 100-page document that contains information. You must summarize and you must summarize the information and ensure that you're giving us the important parts of the information, right? And it must be cost effective. So giving that information, analyzing that information must be cost effective. It must not be too expensive for the entity, right? So that was the first lecture unit. And then the second lecture unit looks at accounting information systems and management systems. But what is a system? We are talking about these two different systems, but what is a system? So a system is a combination of different elements that work together towards a common objective. So I gave a very simple example that you could have different components or different parts in a car that are working together to make the car move, to make the car work. So all those different components that are working together towards a specific goal, when we look at what that is, we call that a system, right? And then we are going to have an information system, right? And an information system is described as formal procedures to collect, process, and distribute information to users. So an information system is going to collect the data, process the data, and then communicate that data to the users, right? And what kind of users could we look at? We are looking at stakeholders, your employees, your management, your shareholders, your customers, etc., right? And then we look at accounting information systems. So on the other hand, right, we just looked at information system and said it's formal procedures that allow us to collect the data, process the data, and communicate it to users. And on the other hand, we have AIS, right? And it focuses on obviously collecting, processing, and distributing now economic financial data, right? So with information system, we just it's literally the umbrella. And then we're gonna have accounting information system, which collects accounting related information, which for example, the number of customers that you have, your sales figures, etc. And then we are gonna have management information systems, right? So with management information systems, on the other hand, they look at managing non-financial information, right? So with non-financial information, I gave the example of managing information such as customer complaints. So that's not economic related, right? It has nothing to do with the finances of the business, right? It has to do with customer complaints. It's non-financial. So that's what management information system would look at, right? And then the next thing that we look at is data management systems. So we have 3 data management systems. We have the flat file system, we have the central networks versus decentralized networks, as well as cloud computing, right? So with the flat file system, it is a data management system in which the data is stored in a table with columns and rows. So with the flat file system, it's basically, you could think of CRJs, CPJs. We are just putting the data in a table that has columns and that has rows, right? It's just the basic way of collecting the data, storing the data. So that's what a flat file system could look at. And then we are going to have centralized and decentralized networks. So with the centralized network, we are saying that all the users, so you could have, for example, the whole school, right? The whole school is going to use one server. So let's just say the students. So if you look at the students, you're going to have one server. We are all going to go to, for example, the student self-service portal. So every student, every single user is going to go to one place, one server, right? And we could say, for example, the student self-service portal. So that would be an example of a centralized network. And then a decentralized network forms groups within the entity, and then each group is going to have its own server. So for example, you could be looking at KPMG, right, as an entity. I'm not sure if you guys know KPMG. It's one of the big 4 companies. You could be looking at KPMG and then the different branches that KPMG has within South Africa. So let's say it has branches in KZN, in all the other provinces. Let's say it has 5 branches. So a decentralized method in that instance would say that the KPMG in Gauteng is going to have its own server, so its own information, it's going to manage its own information. And then the one in Cape Town is going to have its own information. The one in KZN is going to have its own information and own server. So the different servers are now separated, and each entity has its own data, how it processes its own data, its own sales figure, different from the other countries because they're using different servers, right? So they would go to different websites on their own to look at their own data. So the data that is accessible to people in Gauteng would not be accessible to people in Eastern Cape, in Durban, etc. So that's how a decentralized would work. And then the last one is cloud computing. So with cloud computing, we're just basically saying that the information is stored remotely. So we are not storing the information on paper. So you're just storing the information on a cloud service, for example, Google Drive. And when you store it, it can be accessible by people you want to access that information, right? And then we could look at disadvantages and advantages of a database system. So advantages could include things like it improves data sharing. Just made the example of Google Drive. It improves data security. So for example, you're gonna pay to have systems that protect you from cybercrime. So it improves your data security. And also the data is not easily lost, because obviously if you put something on a Google Drive last year, you are still going to find it as long as it's backed up and you didn't delete that item, right? So yes, it improves decision making, etc. And then disadvantages could include things like it increases costs. Obviously, you have to now hire people to protect you against cyber crimes, etc. And sometimes you might have to, get into subscriptions to use cloud computing, right? And then cyber crimes, as I said. And then there are the last thing that we look at is the 6 components of an accounting information system. So the first one is people, right? So these are the components. So if a question has to come in, it was like, what are the components of an IS, right? AIS. So it would be people. People are the users of the information. And then it would be procedures. These are the systems that are used to collect and capture the data. And it must be consistent throughout the entity. So how you are collecting the data must be consistent. You can't in one moment be collecting the data manually, and then all of a sudden you are collecting the data using another system. For example, you could be using the automated system, for example, the one that is used by Pick n Pay. So if you are deciding to collect the data manually, you can't on a Tuesday collect it manually, and on a Thursday now use barcode systems, right? So it must be consistent throughout a period. You can't be mix mashing as you please, right? So procedures, and we are saying that this must be coded into employees as well through training. So the employees must be trained on how to collect the data, and it must be consistent, obviously. So if you are using the manual one, they must know how to manually collect the data. You must know how to manually process the data. And then if it would be an automated system, they should know, if you go to Pick n Pay and they scan the barcode, they should know how to, the cashiers should know how to do their thing, right? And then data is unprocessed information. So it's what you are collecting, the people that are going to be using the processed data, which will be information, and then procedures on how to collect that data. So it interlinks with the 2 points we just discussed. And then we look at hardware and software. Hardware is the touchable, what you can touch in your computer or your AIS. And then software is the intangible parts of your AIS, right? And then internal controls, that's the last thing. So internal controls basically looks at what the entity is doing to mitigate risk, right? What is the entity doing in order to mitigate against theft of personal information? What is the entity doing to mitigate against cybercrime, etc.? What is the entity doing internally to mitigate against those things, right? And then we look at the POPI Act. So the POPI Act is basically an act that says that you need to protect people's personal information, so you can't share it, because we're looking at information and data processing. That is important in the sense that as much as you are collecting this data, as much as you are processing this data, and as much as you are using this data towards making informed decisions, you must protect people's data. You cannot just share it to anyone or sell the data for that matter. So yes, that brings us to the end of this video, guys. Hopefully it helped you all.